What happens when an entire galaxy underestimates the wrong species? For millennia, the Galactic Council believed humans were nothing more than weak, emotional creatures, barely worthy of membership among the starfaring races. They saw our tears as weakness, our compassion as foolishness, and our reluctance to kill as cowardice. They were catastrophically wrong. When pushed to the edge, when everything we love hangs in the balance, humans don't just fight back. We become something that makes the universe's most feared predators look like house pets. We become the apex hunters that evolution spent millions of years perfecting, wrapped in a deceptively gentle package. This is the story of Marcus Chun, a simple human maintenance worker who everyone dismissed as harmless. A man so unremarkable that alien species used him as proof that humans posed no threat to anyone. But when an ancient evil awakens and threatens to devour every living soul in the galaxy, Marcus will show them all what happens when you corner a human with nothing left to lose. Sometimes the greatest predators are the ones you never see coming. Are you ready to witness the birth of a legend? Marcus Chun wiped the grease from his hands with a worn cloth, surveying the massive hyperdrive engine that hummed quietly in the bowels of the Galactic Council station. The other maintenance workers had long since finished their shifts, leaving him alone with the steady thrum of machinery and the distant sounds of alien voices echoing through the corridors above. At 32, Marcus had spent the last 8 years keeping the station running, fixing everything from atmosphere processors to waste reclamation systems. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid enough to send credits back to his family on Earth, and gave him a quiet corner of space to call home. The station housed representatives from 47 different species, all members of the prestigious Galactic Council. Humans have been granted membership only recently, and most aliens still viewed them with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed disdain. Marcus had grown used to the condescending looks and whispered comments about human weakness. Another day, another broken motivator, he muttered, shouldering his toolkit and heading for the next repair order on his datapad. The corridor stretched ahead of him, lined with the distinctive blue lighting that helped accommodate the various visual spectrums of different species. As he walked, Marcus passed a group of Vorthan diplomats heading toward the central assembly hall. The tall, reptilian beings wore elaborate ceremonial robes and spoke in their clicking language. One of them noticed Marcus and made a comment that caused the others to laugh with sharp, barking sounds. Marcus understood enough Vorthan to know they were discussing human fragility again. It was a common topic of conversation among the alien species. Humans were seen as weak, emotional creatures who cried when sad and hesitated to kill even their enemies. Most aliens found this behavior both puzzling and pathetic. He continued down the corridor, unbothered by their comments. After 8 years of similar treatment, Marcus had developed thick skin. Besides, he had more pressing concerns than alien prejudice. His sister Sarah's medical treatments on Earth were expensive, and he needed this job to keep paying for them. The next repair was in Section C7, a storage area used by the Krillian delegation. The Krillians were insectoid beings known for their aggressive nature and complete lack of empathy. Their storage units contained various weapons and military equipment, all perfectly legal according to galactic law, but intimidating nonetheless. Marcus found a malfunctioning unit and began his diagnostic routine. The problem appeared to be a simple power coupling failure, but as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about the equipment today. The Krillians had been unusually active lately, and their storage requests had increased dramatically over the past few weeks. Human, a voice chittered behind him. Marcus turned to see Ambassador Zach Th, the head of the Krillian delegation. The insectoid stood nearly 8 feet tall, with 4 arms and compound eyes that reflected the corridor lighting like black mirrors. His mandibles clicked constantly when he spoke, giving his words a sharp, threatening quality. Ambassador, Marcus replied respectfully. I'm just finishing up with your storage unit. Should be working perfectly in another few minutes. How convenient. Zacth said, moving closer. Tell me, human, do you ever wonder why your species was granted council membership? The question caught Marcus off guard. In 8 years, no council member had ever asked him about galactic politics. Most barely acknowledged his existence beyond filing repair requests. I assume Earth met the standard requirements, Marcus said carefully, continuing to work on the coupling. Scientific advancement, space travel capability, stable government. Requirements, Zacth repeated, his mandibles clicking with what Marcus had learned was the Krillian equivalent of laughter. Yes, your species barely met the minimum standards. But that wasn't why you were accepted. Marcus paused in his work, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere important. Why then? Because you're harmless, Zacth said bluntly. Your species is so pathetically weak and emotional that you pose no threat to anyone. You were accepted as a joke, human. A living example of how merciful and inclusive the council could be. The ambassador's words stung, but Marcus forced himself to remain calm. Getting angry would only prove the alien's point about human emotional instability. I see, Marcus said quietly. Well, thank you for the honesty. Do you know what we call humans in our military briefings? Zacth continued, apparently enjoying himself. Prey. Not enemies, not rivals, not even obstacles. Prey. Because that's all your species will ever be. Marcus finished the repair and closed the access panel. Your storage unit is fixed, Ambassador. Is there anything else you need? Zacth studied him with those reflective compound eyes. Remarkable. Even direct insults cannot provoke you to anger. Perhaps the reports about human weakness are understated. The Krillian turned and stalked away, leaving Marcus alone with his tools and his thoughts. He'd heard similar comments before, but something about Zacth's tone suggested this wasn't just casual cruelty. The ambassador had seemed to be testing him, gauging his reaction for some specific purpose. Marcus packed his tools and made his way to the main maintenance office to file his repair report. The office was located near the station's central hub, where the various species' quarters branched out like spokes on a wheel. It was one of the few areas where humans were commonly seen, since most of the technical support staff came from Earth. His supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, was still at her desk despite the late hour. She looked up as he entered, her expression troubled. Marcus, good timing. We need to talk. He set down his toolkit and took a seat across from her desk. Janet had been his boss for 3 years, and he'd never seen her look this worried. What's going on? Strange reports coming in from all over the station, she said, pulling up several files on her computer. Equipment failures, power fluctuations, sensor malfunctions. All minor stuff individually, but when you look at the pattern, she turned the screen toward him. Marcus studied the data, his engineering background helping him spot the anomalies quickly. These aren't random failures, he said. Someone's systematically compromising station security. That's what I thought too. But when I brought it to Security Chief Vextar, he dismissed it as human paranoia, said we see conspiracies everywhere because we're naturally fearful. Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing the information. The timing of these malfunctions, combined with Zacth's strange behavior, was starting to form a troubling picture. Have you noticed anything unusual about the various delegations lately? He asked. Janet nodded grimly. Increased weapons requests, extended private meetings, and a lot of encrypted communications. Whatever's happening, it's big. Before Marcus could respond, the station's emergency alert system activated. Red lights flashed throughout the maintenance office, and a synthesized voice began speaking in the common galactic language. All personnel report to designated safety stations. This is not a drill. All personnel report to designated safety stations immediately. Marcus and Janet exchanged worried looks. In 8 years, Marcus had never heard a real emergency alert on the station. They left the office and joined a stream of beings heading toward the safety stations. The corridors buzzed with nervous chatter in dozens of languages as diplomats, staff members, and visitors tried to understand what was happening. The human safety station was located in Section B-12, a reinforced area designed to protect the more fragile species during emergencies. As they arrived, Marcus saw that most of the station's human population was already there, roughly 30 people including maintenance staff, diplomatic assistants, and a few trade representatives. Security Chief Vextar, a tall, blue-skinned Altarian with multiple eyes arranged around his head, stood at the front of the group. His usual arrogant demeanor seemed strained, and his skin had taken on a darker shade that Marcus knew indicated stress in his species. "Attention, humans," Vextar announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "We have detected an unauthorized vessel approaching the station. Standard protocol requires all non-essential personnel to remain in safety areas until the situation is resolved." "What kind of vessel?" asked Dr. Elizabeth Wright, the head of the human medical team. "That information is classified," Vextar replied curtly. "You will remain here until further notice." The security chief left without answering any other questions, leaving the humans locked in their designated safety area. Marcus noticed that the locking mechanism had been activated from the outside, effectively trapping them. "This doesn't feel like standard safety protocol," Janet whispered. Marcus nodded, his mind racing. The equipment failures, the strange behavior from various delegations, and now humans being specifically confined while other species remained free to move about the station. It was starting to look less like a security alert and more like a trap. He quietly made his way to the emergency communication panel and tried to access the station's internal network. Most functions were locked down during alerts, but his maintenance clearance still gave him access to the environmental systems. What he found in the environmental logs made his blood run cold. The approaching vessel wasn't unauthorized at all. It was expected, invited even. The communication log showed coordination between multiple council delegations and the incoming ship. Worse, the vessel's identification markers matched those of the Devourers, an ancient predatory species that the galaxy had thought extinct for over 1,000 years. Marcus turned back to the group of trapped humans, his mind struggling to process what he discovered. The Galactic Council hadn't just failed to protect humanity from an external threat. They had actively collaborated with something far worse than any of them could imagine. And now, locked in this room like cattle awaiting slaughter, the humans would finally understand why the rest of the galaxy had been so eager to dismiss them as harmless prey. The real test was about to begin. The emergency lights cast eerie shadows across the confined humans as Marcus stared at the communication logs on his screen. The Devourers. Even the name sent chills down his spine. He remembered learning about them in galactic history classes, though most of the records had been classified or destroyed. What little remained painted a picture of absolute horror. "Marcus, what did you find?" Janet asked quietly, noticing his pale expression. He turned the screen toward her, keeping his voice low to avoid panic among the others. "The incoming ship, it's not unauthorized. The Council invited them here." Janet's eyes widened as she read the data. "Devourers? But they're supposed to be extinct." "Apparently not," Marcus whispered. "And according to these communications, every major delegation on the station has been coordinating their arrival for weeks." The realization hit them both simultaneously. The humans hadn't been locked up for their protection. They were being prepared as an offering. Before they could discuss it further, the lights in their section dimmed, and a low, rhythmic pulsing began emanating from the station's hull. The sound wasn't mechanical. It was organic, like a massive heartbeat echoing through the metal. Dr. Wright approached them, her medical training making her more attuned to biological phenomena. "That's not coming from our ship systems. Whatever just docked with us, it's alive." The other humans in the room began to notice the sound as well. Conversations died away as the rhythmic pulsing grew stronger, seeming to resonate directly in their bones. Marcus closed the environmental system and stood up. "Listen to me, everyone. We need to get out of this room. Now." "The door's locked from the outside," protested Mark Sullivan, one of the trade representatives. "Security protocol, remember?" "This isn't about security," Marcus replied firmly. "We've been betrayed. The Council has made some kind of deal, and we're part of the payment. The group stared at him in disbelief. These were educated, experienced people who had spent years working alongside alien species. The idea that the Galactic Council would deliberately sacrifice humans seemed impossible. "That's ridiculous," Dr. Wright said. "The Council has laws, protocols, ethics committees. They can't just—" Her words were cut off by a new sound echoing through the station's corridors. It was a voice, but not like any they had heard before. The words were in the ancient galactic language, spoken with a resonance that seemed to bypass their ears and speak directly to their primal fears. Even without understanding the exact words, every human in the room felt their instincts screaming danger. It was the same evolutionary response that had kept their ancestors alive when they encountered predators in the dark. Except this predator was something far beyond anything Earth had ever produced. Marcus moved to the door's control panel and began examining the locking mechanism. His maintenance background had given him extensive knowledge of the station's systems, including the emergency protocols. "Can you get us out?" Janet asked. "Maybe," he replied, pulling out his tools. "But even if I can, where do we go? The whole station's compromised." "The maintenance tunnels," suggested Tom Bradley, another engineer. "They run throughout the station and connect to all the major systems." Marcus nodded. "Good thinking. If we can reach the main computer core, maybe we can figure out exactly what's happening and find a way to call for help." As he worked on the door's electronics, the organic pulsing from the docked ship grew stronger. It was joined by new sounds, heavy footsteps in the corridors above, alien voices speaking in urgent, reverent tones, and something else that made their skin crawl. Feeding sounds. The Devourers had arrived, and they were already beginning their work. Marcus finally managed to override the locking mechanism, and the door slid open with a quiet hiss. The corridor beyond was dimly lit, emergency lighting casting long shadows. Most importantly, it appeared to be empty. "Stay close and stay quiet," Marcus whispered. "We need to reach maintenance shaft C14. It connects to the computer core." The group moved cautiously into the corridor, their footsteps muffled on the station's synthetic flooring. As they walked, they could hear the sounds of activity from other parts of the station. Voices raised in what sounded like celebration, mechanical noises, and underneath it all, the continuing organic pulse of the Devourer's ship. They reached the maintenance shaft without incident. Marcus opened the access panel and gestured for the others to follow him into the narrow tunnel that ran parallel to the main corridors. The maintenance tunnels were cramped and poorly lit, forcing them to move in single file. Marcus led the way, using his intimate knowledge of the station's layout to navigate toward the computer core. Behind him, he could hear the quiet breathing of 30 frightened humans who were beginning to understand that their entire understanding of their place in the galaxy had been wrong. As they crawled through the tunnels, Marcus found himself thinking about Zach TH's words earlier. The Krillian ambassador had called humans prey, and now it seemed that assessment had been devastatingly accurate. But there was something else bothering him about that conversation, something that didn't quite fit. If the Council truly saw humans as harmless prey, why had they felt the need to lock them up? Why not simply let the Devourers hunt them freely throughout the station? The answer came to him as they reached a junction in the tunnel system. The aliens weren't just underestimating humans. They were afraid of something. Afraid enough to make sure humans were contained before their ancient allies arrived. But afraid of what? Marcus pushed the thought aside as they approached the computer core access point. Through a small viewing port, he could see into the main computer chamber. It was a vast room filled with processing units and data storage systems that managed every aspect of the station's operations. More importantly, it was currently occupied. 3 figures stood around the central processing unit. Ambassador Zach TH, a tall Altarian official Marcus didn't recognize, and something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The third figure was clearly one of the Devourers. It stood nearly 10 feet tall, with a form that seemed to shift and flow like living shadow. Its face was a nightmare of teeth and eyes, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. When it moved, reality seemed to bend slightly around it, as if the universe itself recoiled from its presence. "The humans are secured?" the creature asked, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies human ears weren't meant to detect. "Locked in their designated area," Zacth replied. 30 individuals, as agreed upon." "Excellent. And their warriors? Their military personnel?" "Humans have no warriors," the Altarian official said with what sounded like amusement. "They're a peaceful species. They negotiate instead of fighting, cry instead of killing. You will find them most cooperative." The Devourer made a sound that might have been laughter, though it carried undertones of hunger that made Marcus's stomach turn. "How delightful! It has been centuries since we encountered truly passive prey." Marcus felt rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Getting angry wouldn't help anyone, and they needed information more than they needed revenge. "When do we begin?" the creature continued. "Immediately," Zacth said. "But remember our agreement. The humans are yours, but the other species remain untouched. This is a limited arrangement." "Of course," the Devourer agreed, though something in its tone suggested it had very different ideas about the limits of their arrangement. "We shall begin with the most tender specimens and work our way up. The process should take several hours." Marcus had heard enough. He carefully backed away from the viewing port and gestured for the others to retreat further into the tunnel. When they were far enough away to whisper safely, he gathered them around and explained what he had witnessed. The reaction was predictably intense. Some of the humans broke down in tears, others became angry, and a few simply stared in shocked disbelief. Dr. Wright was among the latter group. "They can't do this," she whispered. "There are laws, protocols, galactic treaties, none of which apply when the Council decides to sacrifice an entire species," Marcus replied grimly. "We're on our own." "So what we do?" asked Janet. 30 maintenance workers and office staff against an entire station full of hostile aliens and creatures from the worst nightmare the galaxy has ever produced? It was a fair question, and Marcus didn't have a good answer. By any reasonable measure, they were completely outmatched. The smart thing to do would be to find the most secure hiding place possible and hope that somehow rescue would arrive. But as he looked at the frightened faces around him, Marcus felt something stirring in his chest. It wasn't panic or despair, it was anger. Cold, focused anger unlike anything he had ever experienced. For 8 years, he had endured the casual cruelty and condescension of alien species who viewed humans as weak and pathetic. He had accepted their dismissive comments, their casual insults, their complete lack of respect. He had convinced himself that keeping his head down and doing his job was the mature, responsible thing to do. But now those same aliens had revealed their true nature. They hadn't just failed to protect humans. They had actively conspired to feed them to monsters. The anger continued to build, and with it came a clarity of purpose that Marcus had never experienced. The aliens thought humans were weak because they cried, because they showed emotion, because they preferred negotiation to violence. They were about to learn that those same emotions, when pushed beyond certain limits, could transform a maintenance worker into something they had never anticipated. "We're going to fight back," Marcus said quietly. The others stared at him in disbelief. "Marcus," Janet said gently, "I understand you're angry, but we're not soldiers. We're not equipped for combat." "No," Marcus agreed. "We're not soldiers, but we're humans. And humans have spent millions of years becoming very good at surviving things that want to kill us." He looked around at each face in the dim tunnel lighting. "The aliens think they know what we are. They think we're weak, emotional, harmless prey. But they've never seen what humans become when someone threatens our family." The word family resonated in the confined space. These 30 people weren't just co-workers. They were the only humans for thousands of light years. They were all they had. "I'm not talking about charging into battle with makeshift weapons," Marcus continued. I'm talking about using what we actually are. We're engineers, doctors, technicians, administrators. We understand systems, we understand psychology, and we understand how to break things. Tom Bradley nodded slowly. You want us to sabotage the station? I want us to become the predators, Marcus replied. Because that's what we really are. We're persistence hunters from a death world, and we've been hiding it so well that even we forgot. The pulsing from the Devourer's ship grew stronger, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the first screams beginning. It was time to remember what humans really were when everything they loved was at stake. The screams from the station's upper levels grew louder as Marcus led his group deeper into the maintenance tunnel system. The sound was distinctly non-human, which meant the Devourers had started with other species first. Perhaps they were saving the humans for last, or perhaps they simply preferred to terrorize their intended prey with the sounds of others dying. Either way, it gave Marcus and his people precious time to prepare. Listen carefully, Marcus whispered as they gathered in a wider section of the tunnel near the main power distribution center. We're going to split into teams. Each team has a specific objective. He pulled out his datapad and displayed a schematic of the station. Tom, I need you to take 5 people and get to the environmental controls. Start with the atmospheric processors. If we can alter the gas mixture in specific sections, we can make those areas uninhabitable for certain species. Tom studied the map. What about emergency life support? Override it. Force every section to draw from manual backup systems. That'll slow down response times and divide their attention. Dr. Wright raised her hand. What about me and my medical team? Marcus turned to her with an expression that made her step back slightly. There was something different about him now, something that reminded her of documentaries she'd seen about apex predators. You know alien physiology better than anyone else here, he said. I need you to identify weak points, pressure points, toxin vulnerabilities, anything we can exploit. Then, I need you to prepare countermeasures for whatever the Devourers might do to incapacitated humans. Countermeasures? She asked. They're going to try to take some of us alive, Marcus replied matter-of-factly. When they do, I want those people to survive long enough for us to rescue them. The casual certainty in his voice was unsettling. Marcus was talking about rescue operations against creatures that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia, as if it were simply another maintenance job. Janet, he continued, I need you and your team to access the communication systems. Find out everything you can about the Devourer's ship, its capabilities, its weaknesses, how it connects to the station. Also, start broadcasting distress signals on every frequency you can access. Won't they detect our transmissions? I'm counting on it. When they trace the signals back to the communication center, they'll find a very unpleasant surprise waiting for them. Marcus assigned tasks to the remaining teams: power grid sabotage, artificial gravity manipulation, and what he cryptically referred to as psychological warfare preparation. Each group received detailed instructions and backup plans. As the teams prepared to disperse, Dr. Wright approached Marcus privately. This is suicide, you know that, right? We're talking about creatures that consumed entire civilizations. Marcus looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold depths she hadn't noticed before. Doctor, what do you know about persistence hunting? The question caught her off guard. It's an ancient human hunting technique, chasing prey until it collapses from exhaustion. But I don't see what our ancestors used it to hunt animals much larger and stronger than they were, Marcus interrupted. Mammoths, giant deer, cave bears. They didn't try to overpower their prey. They simply refused to stop chasing it until it died of exhaustion. That's not the same as this situation, isn't it? Marcus asked. The Devourers think they're hunting us. But what they've actually done is trap themselves on a space station with 30 humans who have nothing left to lose. They have superior strength, advanced technology, and experience. But we have something they don't, which is time, and the absolute certainty that we're going to kill every single one of them. The cold conviction in his voice made Dr. Wright shiver. She was beginning to understand that something fundamental had changed in Marcus when he realized they'd been betrayed. The gentle maintenance worker she'd known for years was still there, but something else had awakened beneath the surface. Something that had been waiting a very long time to be needed. The teams dispersed through the tunnel system, each heading toward their assigned objectives. Marcus took the smallest group, just 3 people, and headed toward the most dangerous target, the docking bay where the Devourer's ship had attached itself to the station. As they crawled through the narrow passages, Marcus found himself thinking about Earth. Not the sanitized version they presented to alien species, but the real Earth. The planet where every major life form had spent millions of years trying to kill every other major life form. Where humans had clawed their way to the top of the food chain not through strength or speed, but through sheer stubborn refusal to die. The aliens had seen human tears and assumed weakness. They had seen human negotiations and assumed cowardice. They had completely failed to understand that these were the behaviors of a species confident enough in its own lethality to show restraint. But restraint, like any resource, could be exhausted. Marcus and his team reached the access point nearest to the docking bay and carefully opened the viewing port. What they saw beyond made his companions gasp in horror. The docking bay had been transformed into something that belonged in humanity's worst nightmares. The Devourer's ship wasn't just attached to the station. It had merged with it, growing organic extensions that penetrated deep into the station structure. The bay itself pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to look at directly. But it was the Devourers themselves that truly inspired terror. Marcus had seen only one of them earlier, but now he could observe them in their native element. They moved like liquid shadow, their forms constantly shifting between different configurations of limbs and sensory organs. Some appeared roughly humanoid. Others resembled geometric impossibilities that shouldn't have been able to exist in normal space. And they were feeding. The bay contained several large, transparent containers filled with a liquid that glowed with the same bioluminescent patterns as the ship. Suspended in these containers were various alien beings, some still alive and conscious. Marcus recognized a few faces, diplomats, and staff members he had worked with over the years. The Devourers moved between the containers, occasionally reaching in to extract nutrients directly from their prisoners. The process was clearly designed to prolong suffering rather than to efficiently gather sustenance. "My God," whispered Sarah Kim, one of the technicians in Marcus's group. "They're torturing them." "No, Marcus corrected quietly. They're farming them. This isn't about sustenance, it's about fear. They're harvesting terror as much as flesh." The observation triggered another realization. The Devourers weren't just physically dangerous. They were psychological predators that fed on the fear and despair of their victims. That's why the Council had been so careful to contain the humans before the creatures arrived. Not because they feared human strength, but because they feared human unpredictability. A species that didn't respond to terror the way other species did would be a significant problem for creatures that relied on fear as much as physical dominance. Marcus smiled for the first time since the crisis began. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Change of plans," he whispered to his team. "We're not sabotaging their ship. We're going to steal it." His companions stared at him in disbelief. "Marcus," Sarah said carefully, "that ship is alive. It's probably connected to the Devourer's nervous systems. We can't just—" "Watch me," Marcus replied, pulling out his tools and beginning to examine the access panel. "Tom, I need you to get to the main power coupling for this section. When I give the signal, cut power to everything except emergency lighting. What about the ship's own power source?" "That's what these are for," Marcus said, pulling out several small devices that looked like standard diagnostic tools. Jury-rigged electromagnetic pulse generators. They won't destroy the ship, but they'll disrupt its neural connections long enough for us to establish control. Sarah shook her head. "Even if we could somehow take control of their ship, then what? We can't fight them with their own technology." "We're not going to fight them with their technology," Marcus replied, his hands working steadily on the control panel. We're going to fight them with ours. Human technology, human psychology, human ruthlessness. We don't have any weapons. Marcus paused in his work and looked at her directly. Sarah, you're sitting inside a space station with a nuclear reactor, artificial gravity generators, atmosphere processors, water recycling systems, and waste management facilities. Every single one of those systems can be turned into a weapon if you know what you're doing. But we're not warriors. No, Marcus agreed. We're something worse. We're engineers with a grudge. As if to emphasize his point, the station shuddered slightly as Tom's team began their work on the environmental systems. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear alien voices raised in alarm as atmospheric conditions began changing throughout the station. Marcus finished his work on the access panel and gestured for his team to take cover. Remember, when the EMPs go off, we'll have maybe 10 minutes before their nervous system adaptations compensate. We need to be aboard and in control before then. He activated the first pulse generator and watched as the organic lights in the docking bay flickered and dimmed. The Devourer's ship convulsed, its biomechanical systems struggling to maintain coherence as electromagnetic chaos disrupted their neural pathways. In the feeding containers, the imprisoned aliens suddenly began thrashing as their captor's attention was forcibly diverted to dealing with the technological assault on their vessel. Marcus stood up, his expression calm despite the chaos around them. Time to go to work. As they prepared to enter the docking bay, another team's sabotage efforts began bearing fruit. The artificial gravity in several sections of the station began fluctuating wildly, and emergency klaxons started sounding throughout the complex. The Devourers had come to the station expecting to harvest terrified prey. Instead, they were about to discover what humans became when they stopped pretending to be harmless. The electromagnetic pulse rippled through the Devourer's ship like a technological earthquake, causing the organic walls to spasm and the bioluminescent patterns to flicker chaotically. Marcus didn't wait for the effects to stabilize. He sprinted across the docking bay toward the ship's entrance, his small team close behind. The entrance itself was a writhing sphincter of muscle and metal that had sealed shut when the pulse hit. Marcus pulled out a plasma cutter from his toolkit and began working on the biological locks, his years of experience with alien technology serving him well even in this nightmarish context. Hurry, urged Sarah, watching nervously as the ship's systems began to recover from the electromagnetic assault. The lights are getting brighter. Marcus finished cutting through the organic seals and forced the entrance open. The interior of the ship was a maze of corridors that seemed to shift and change as they watched, but Marcus noticed that the changes followed certain patterns he recognized from his maintenance work on biological waste processing systems. It's not random, he muttered, studying the shifting walls. It's a circulation system. The ship routes nutrients and information through these passages. How does that help us? Asked Tom, who had joined them after completing his sabotage of the power systems. Because circulation systems have control nodes, Marcus replied, pulling out his datapad and beginning to map the ship's layout. If we can reach the central processing area, we can take control of the entire vessel. They moved deeper into the ship, following Marcus's improvised navigation system. The corridors were lined with the same transparent containers they had seen in the docking bay, but these held different contents. Some contained what appeared to be genetic samples from various species. Others held complex organic machinery that pulsed with its own internal rhythms. Most disturbing were the containers that held neural tissue, disembodied brains from dozens of different species, all still active and aware, serving as processing nodes for the ship's consciousness. They're keeping them alive, Dr. Wright whispered in horror. She had joined Marcus's team after delegating her medical sabotage tasks to her assistants. These brains are all conscious. The ship is using them as a biological computer network. Marcus studied the neural containers with professional interest rather than revulsion, which means the ship's intelligence is distributed rather than centralized. We can't just take out one control center. We need to override the entire network. How do we override the minds of dozens of different species? We don't, Marcus replied, pulling out another of his jury-rigged devices. We had our own. The device was a neural interface adapter that Marcus had cobbled together from diagnostic equipment. It was crude and probably dangerous, but it would allow a human brain to connect directly to the ship's biological network. That's insane, Dr. Wright protested. You have no idea what that interface might do to your nervous system. The alien brain chemistry alone could kill you. Maybe, Marcus agreed. But if it works, I'll have direct access to the ship's motor functions, weapons systems, and sensory apparatus. I could turn their own vessel against them. Before anyone could argue further, the ship shuddered as something large moved through the corridors toward them. The Devourers had recovered from the electromagnetic pulse and were coming to investigate the intrusion. Marcus quickly attached the neural interface to his skull, ignoring the immediate burning sensation as alien circuitry interfaced with his brain. The pain was overwhelming for a moment. Then, suddenly, everything changed. Marcus found himself experiencing the ship as a living entity. He could feel the circulation of nutrients through its organic systems, the electrical impulses that carried information between neural nodes, the complex chemical processes that maintained its structural integrity. More importantly, he could sense the Devourers moving through the corridors like antibodies responding to an infection. But there was something else in the ship's consciousness, something the Devourers themselves weren't aware of. The neural networks they had created from captured brains hadn't been completely subsumed. Parts of those original personalities still existed, hidden in unused processing capacity, waiting for an opportunity to rebel against their captors. Marcus reached out to those fragmented consciousnesses with his own mind, offering them a chance for revenge. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of alien minds, representing species from across the galaxy, linked with his consciousness in a collaborative network focused on a single goal: destroying the creatures that had enslaved them. Through the ship's sensory systems, Marcus could see the Devourers approaching his physical location. But now he had the ability to respond. The corridor walls began to shift, creating barriers and obstacles that slowed their advance. Atmospheric vents opened, flooding their path with gases that disrupted their respiratory systems. Most satisfying of all, Marcus gained access to the ship's weapons systems. The vessel's primary armament wasn't designed for space combat. It was designed for planetary consumption. Massive biomechanical drilling devices that could bore through planetary crusts, molecular disassemblers that could break down entire ecosystems, viral weapons that could reshape the genetic structure of entire species. Marcus turned all of them against the station, but not randomly. With surgical precision, guided by 8 years of intimate knowledge of the station's layout, he began targeting specific sections. The areas where the council members had gathered to celebrate their deal with the Devourers found themselves suddenly experiencing catastrophic system failures. Artificial gravity reversed, atmosphere became toxic, and structural supports began dissolving at the molecular level. Through the ship's communication systems, Marcus could hear the panicked voices of the alien diplomats who had so casually agreed to sacrifice humanity. Their arrogant confidence had transformed into terror as they realized they had made a deal with creatures that had no intention of honoring any agreements. Marcus, Dr. Wright's voice seemed to come from very far away, even though she was standing right beside his physical body. Your vitals are going crazy. You need to disconnect. But Marcus wasn't ready to disconnect. Through the ship's neural network, he had access to information that the Devourers had collected over millennia of conquest. He could see the true history of the galaxy, not the sanitized version taught in schools, but the real story of endless cycles of predation and submission. The Galactic Council wasn't a voluntary association of equals. It was a protection racket run by the most successful predator species, with the Devourers as their ultimate enforcement mechanism. Every few centuries, when populations grew too comfortable or independent, the Council would arrange for a random Devourer attack to remind everyone why they needed protection. Humanity's admission to the Council hadn't been recognition of their achievements. It had been preparation for their sacrifice. They had been selected as the next species to be fed to the monsters, chosen specifically because their emotional responses and negotiation preferences made them seem like ideal victims. But the Council had made a critical error in their assessment. They had confused human restraint with human helplessness. They had mistaken civilization for weakness. Through the ship's weapons systems, Marcus began broadcasting a message on all galactic communication frequencies. Not words, but pure emotional content transmitted directly through bioneural interfaces. Every species in the galaxy with the technology to receive, it would experience exactly what Marcus was feeling in that moment. They would feel the cold, implacable fury of a human who had discovered that his family was in danger. They would experience the calculating intellect of an engineer planning the systematic destruction of everything that threatened what he loved. They would understand, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be hunted by something that refused to stop until its prey was completely dead. The message rippled across the galaxy like a psychic shockwave, carrying with it a simple declaration that would be remembered for generations. Humanity was no longer pretending to be harmless. Back on the station, the other human teams were experiencing their own revelations. As the Devourers found themselves under attack from their own ship, they began to retreat from the upper levels, falling back to defensive positions. But this gave the humans access to areas that had been sealed off during the initial attack. Janet's communication team discovered that the station's databases contained detailed intelligence about Devourer biology and psychology, information that the Council had carefully hidden from their intended victims. The creatures that seemed so invincible had specific vulnerabilities that human technology could exploit. Tom's environmental systems team learned that the atmosphere processors could be modified to produce chemical compounds that were harmless to most galactic species, but highly toxic to Devourer physiology. Dr. Wright's medical team found that certain human biochemical markers could disrupt the creature's fear-harvesting mechanisms, essentially making humans inedible to their preferred consumption methods. But most importantly, they were discovering that the Devourer's reputation for invincibility was largely psychological warfare. The creatures were formidable predators, but they relied heavily on their victims' terror and submission. When faced with prey that refused to be afraid, their effectiveness dropped dramatically. As Marcus maintained his control over the Devourer's ship, using its own weapons to systematically destroy the Council members who had betrayed humanity, his teammates began implementing their own revenge. Not the chaotic violence of desperate victims, but the methodical elimination protocols of efficient predators. The aliens had wanted to know what humans became when their restraint was removed. They were about to find out. 3 hours after the humans had been locked away as sacrificial offerings, the Galactic Council Station had become a tomb. But it wasn't humanity's tomb. It was a monument to the galaxy's most catastrophic miscalculation. Marcus remained connected to the Devourer's ship's neural network. His consciousness expanded across multiple biological processing nodes. Through the ship's sensory systems, he watched as the last Council members barricaded themselves in their emergency bunker, their earlier arrogance replaced by primal terror. Ambassador Zach TH was among them, his compound eyes reflecting the emergency lighting as he tried to establish communication with other Council installations. When his transmission finally connected, the response was not what he had expected. Council Station Omega. This is Admiral Vextar of the Defense Fleet. We are detecting massive energy signatures from your location. What is your status? Admiral, Zach DH replied, his mandibles clicking with stress patterns. The situation is complicated. The Devourer operation has encountered unexpected resistance. Resistance? From what force? Our intelligence indicated no military presence in that sector. Through the ship's communication systems, Marcus decided to answer that question himself. He opened a channel to the Defense Fleet, but instead of using words, he transmitted pure sensory data. Everything the ship had recorded during the past few hours. The fleet commanders suddenly found themselves experiencing the systematic destruction of their carefully planned operation from the perspective of the predators themselves. They felt the ship's confusion as its own weapons turned against it. They experienced the terror of creatures that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia, finding themselves hunted through corridors they had thought they controlled. Most importantly, they felt the cold, intellectual fury of 30 humans who had discovered the true nature of their supposed allies. The transmission ended with a simple message in standard galactic language. Humanity withdraws from the Galactic Council effective immediately. Any species found to have participated in the attempted genocide will be added to our priority target list. You have been warned. Admiral Vextar's response came after a long pause. Council Station Omega. Did that transmission originate from your location? Zach TH looked around the bunker at his fellow survivors. The carefully planned sacrifice of humanity was supposed to have strengthened the Council's position by demonstrating their control over member species. Instead, it had revealed that they had been harboring something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Admiral, Zach TH said finally, I believe we may have made an error in our assessment of human capabilities. Marcus smiled through the ship's biomechanical interface. That was perhaps the greatest understatement in galactic history. Throughout the station, the other human teams were completing their own missions with methodical efficiency. Dr. Wright had successfully modified the atmospheric processors to produce a chemical cocktail that was slowly weakening the remaining devourers. The creatures that had seemed nearly invincible just hours earlier were now struggling to maintain their coherence as human-engineered toxins disrupted their biological systems. Tom's team had gained complete control over the station's power grid, using selective brownouts and surges to herd the surviving devourers into predetermined areas. Janet's communication specialist had not only established contact with Earth, but had also begun broadcasting detailed intelligence about Council operations to every independent species in the galaxy. The truth about the Council's protection racket was spreading faster than they could contain it. But the most significant development was happening in the neural network that Marcus now shared with the ship's enslaved consciousness. The fragmented minds that the Devourers had captured and repurposed were beginning to integrate with human mental patterns, creating something entirely new. It wasn't assimilation, it was collaboration. Each species contributed its unique perspectives and capabilities to a collective intelligence that retained individual identity while sharing common purpose. The Devourers had inadvertently created the foundation for something they couldn't understand, a truly cooperative multi-species consciousness. And that consciousness was very angry about what had been done to its component parts. Through this expanded awareness, Marcus began to understand the full scope of the galactic situation. The Devourers weren't just random predators. They were a tool used by the Council to maintain control over member species. Their periodic attacks weren't natural hunting behaviors, but carefully orchestrated terrorism designed to keep civilizations dependent on Council protection. Humanity's intended sacrifice had been planned for years, with their admission to the Council serving as the setup for their eventual consumption. But the Council had fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with. They had seen human emotional responses and assumed those emotions made humans weak. They had observed human negotiation preferences and concluded that humans were naturally submissive. They had completely failed to recognize that these behaviors were the result of choice, not incapacity. Humans had developed emotional intelligence and negotiation skills because they were capable of extreme violence. A species that couldn't destroy its enemies had no need to develop alternatives to destruction. Marcus began implementing the final phase of his plan. Through the ship's biomechanical systems, he started converting the vessel's consumption apparatus into something entirely different, a manufacturing facility. The same molecular disassemblers that the Devourers used to break down their victims could be reconfigured to create new materials. The genetic manipulation devices could be used to develop enhanced biological systems. The neural networking technology could be adapted to enable communication between species that had never been able to understand each other before. Within hours, Marcus had transformed the Devourer ship from an instrument of galactic terrorism into the foundation for something unprecedented. A truly cooperative multi-species organization based on mutual benefit rather than fear-based submission. As word of the transformation spread through the galaxy, independent species began reaching out to the station, not seeking protection from the Council, but offering alliance with the humans who had accomplished what no one thought possible, turning the galaxy's ultimate predators into the foundation for a better civilization. The Council's carefully maintained power structure began collapsing as species after species withdrew from their protection agreements. Without the threat of Devourer attacks to keep members in line, the Council had nothing to offer except the same arrogance and exploitation that had driven their decision to sacrifice humanity. In the station's emergency bunker, Ambassador Zach Th watched his life's work crumble as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. The human species that he had dismissed as harmless prey had dismantled an empire that had existed for thousands of years, and they had done it in less than a day. "How?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to his fellow survivors or to the universe itself. "How do we misjudge them so completely?" Marcus, still connected to the ship's neural network, heard the question through the station's communication systems. He decided to answer, speaking directly through the emergency bunker speakers. "You made the same mistake that every predator makes," Marcus said, his voice carrying harmonics from the multi-species consciousness he now shared. "You assumed that because we chose to be gentle, we were incapable of being anything else. But you're so weak," Zach Th protested. "You cry when you're sad. You negotiate instead of fighting. You show mercy to your enemies." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "We do all of those things. Do you know why?" The bunker fell silent. "Because we don't have to kill you to survive," Marcus continued. "We developed emotional intelligence because we're secure enough in our own lethality to afford compassion. We prefer negotiation because we're confident enough in our ability to win wars that we can seek alternatives. We show mercy because we're so dangerous that we can afford to give our enemies second chances." "That makes no sense," one of the other council members said. "It makes perfect sense," Marcus replied. "We're persistence hunters from a death world. When we decide that something needs to die, it dies. There's no escape, no negotiation, no reprieve. We simply keep coming until our target stops existing. But we're also intelligent enough to recognize that killing something should be a last resort, not a first option." The reality of the situation, finally, began to sink in for the council members. They had spent years manipulating a species that could have destroyed them at any time, but had chosen not to out of simple preference for nonviolent solutions. "What happens now?" Zach Th asked quietly. "Now you face the consequences of your choices," Marcus replied. "The galaxy knows what you did. Independent species are already forming new alliances that don't require sacrificing member worlds to maintain order. Your empire built on fear is ending. And us? What happens to us?" Marcus considered the question, feeling the input of dozens of different species through the neural network. The enslaved minds that had been freed from devourer control were calling for revenge, but the human consciousness at the center of the network preferred a different approach. "You'll live," Marcus said finally. "Not because you deserve mercy, but because executing you would make us more like you. The galaxy has had enough predators ruling through fear. It's time to try something different. You're letting us go? I'm letting you survive to see what you could have built if you had chosen cooperation over exploitation. Consider it an educational experience." As the station's life support systems gradually returned to normal operation, the surviving council members found themselves facing an unprecedented situation. They were alive, but their civilization was finished. The galaxy they had ruled through fear and manipulation was evolving into something they couldn't control or understand. Marcus began the delicate process of disconnecting from the ship's neural network, but he maintained communication links with the other consciousnesses he had freed. The Devourer vessel would serve as a mobile embassy for the new Galactic Alliance, carrying representatives from dozens of species to establish diplomatic relations across the galaxy. As his individual consciousness separated from the collective network, Marcus found himself back in his own body for the first time in hours. Dr. Wright immediately began checking his vital signs while his teammates gathered around to hear about his experience. "How do you feel?" Dr. Wright asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. He felt tired, certainly, but also profoundly changed. The experience of sharing consciousness with dozens of different species had given him perspectives he could never have imagined. "Different," he said finally, "but still human. What happens next?" Janet asked. Marcus looked around at the maintenance tunnels where they had planned their rebellion against impossible odds. These narrow passages would be remembered as the birthplace of a new galactic civilization, the place where humanity had finally stopped pretending to be harmless. "Now we go home," Marcus said. "We tell Earth what really happened here, and we prepare for the future, because the galaxy is going to be a very different place from now on." As they made their way back toward the main levels of the station, Marcus reflected on the lessons learned during the crisis. The aliens had been wrong about human nature, but humans had been wrong about their own place in the galaxy. They weren't weak prey waiting to be consumed. They were apex predators who had been so successful that they had forgotten what they truly were. But they remembered now, and the galaxy would never be the same.